My mother's voice didn't even shake when she told me I was no longer welcome at our family table. There was no hesitation, no hint of regret, just a clinical, cold delivery of a verdict I never saw coming. "Talia," she said, her tone as sharp as a winter frost. "You won't be at Thanksgiving this year. Your sister's new husband thinks you'd ruin the vibe." Ruin the vibe. Those 3 words felt like a physical blow to the stomach, knocking the air out of my lungs before I could even process the cruelty behind them. I was standing in my apartment kitchen, the late afternoon sun casting long skeletal shadows across the linoleum. On the counter sat my grocery list, the one I'd been meticulously preparing for the trip back home. I had already written down the ingredients for the rosemary stuffing my dad loved and the specific brand of wine my sister always requested. I was ready to be the daughter, the sister, the piece of the puzzle that made the holiday complete. But apparently, the puzzle had been redesigned, and I was the piece that no longer fit. "I'm sorry, Mom," I managed to whisper, my voice sounding small and foreign in the silence of my own home. "What do you mean, ruin the vibe?" I heard her sigh on the other end of the line, a heavy performative sound, the kind people use when they're tired of a conversation that hasn't even started yet. It was the sound of someone who had already decided I was the antagonist in this story. She told me that Ethan, my sister Chloe's new husband, felt uncomfortable around me. Since this was his first official Thanksgiving with the family, the priority was making him feel at home. And apparently, making him feel at home required making me feel like an exile. "We just don't want any drama, Talia," she added, as if my very existence was a match waiting to be struck. Drama? I barely knew the man. I had met Ethan exactly twice. The first time was at their rushed small wedding dinner where he'd spent most of the night whispering in Chloe's ear, and the second was a brief family brunch a few weeks later where he'd barely looked me in the eye. I had been nothing but polite. I had been a ghost. Yet somehow, I had already become the villain of his narrative. Have you ever wondered how it feels to be erased from your own history by a man who hasn't even been in the family for 6 months? "Does Dad know about this?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone until my knuckles turned a ghostly white. "It was a family decision, honey," she replied, her voice softening just enough to make the betrayal feel even more patronizing. "We think it's best if it's just the 4 of them this year. Maybe next year things will feel different. You understand, don't you?" I didn't understand, but I knew the rules of my family. If I argued, I was difficult. If I cried, I was manipulative. If I asked for an explanation, I was starting drama. The trap was already set. If I fought for my place at the table, I would simply be proving Ethan right. I would be ruining the vibe. So I did the one thing they never expected. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. "I understand, Mom," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "I'll make other plans." I hung up before she could offer any more empty platitudes. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked down at my grocery list at the word rosemary written in my neat looping script, and I felt a wave of nausea. I walked to the trash can and dropped the list inside. It felt like I was throwing away more than just a piece of paper. I was throwing away the illusion that I actually belonged to them. That night, the city outside my window was alive with the hum of holiday anticipation. People were hauling suitcases into taxis, store windows were dripping with gold and crimson decorations, and the air smelled of wood smoke and hope. But inside my apartment, it felt like a tomb. I sat on my sofa in the dark, watching the headlights of passing cars dance across my ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Ethan. Why was he so afraid of me? Because that's what it was, wasn't it? Uncomfortable is just a polite word for threatened. I thought back to that brunch. I remembered the way his eyes had darted to my bag when I pulled out my work ID to find a lip balm. I remembered the way he had suddenly stopped talking when I mentioned my recent promotion. He had asked me a few pointed questions about my office, what floor I was on, what department I headed, how much access I had to internal files. At the time, I thought he was just trying to find common ground. Now, in the cold clarity of my isolation, I realized he wasn't making small talk. He was conducting reconnaissance. Is it possible to hate someone you barely know? Or do you just hate the way they've managed to turn your own blood against you? I didn't sleep. I spent the night staring at the wall, the rejection stinging like a fresh burn. I realized then that my family hadn't just uninvited me. They had traded me. They had traded 26 years of history for a man Chloe had known for less than a year. They chose the vibe over the person. By the time the sun began to bleed over the skyline the next morning, the sadness had hardened into something else. It had calcified into a cold, sharp anger. If they wanted a Thanksgiving without me, they would get it, but they were forgetting one thing. I wasn't just the odd one out daughter. I was Talia Morgan, and in the world outside of our dysfunctional family dinners, that name actually meant something. I went to work early, driving through the deserted morning streets with a sense of grim purpose. My office building, a towering glass monolith in the heart of the financial district, felt more like home than my parents' house ever had. Here things were logical. Here, there were rules. Here, if you did something wrong, there were consequences. I am the compliance director for one of the most rigorous regulatory firms in the country. My job is to find the rot that people try to hide behind polished spreadsheets and expensive suits. I am the person who looks at the vibe of a company and sees the crime underneath. As I walked through the lobby, the security guards nodded to me with respect. My heels clicked against the marble floors, a rhythmic predatory sound that made me feel steady again. I liked being the person people were afraid of for a reason. I had just settled at my desk, the glow of my triple monitors reflecting in my glasses when my assistant Sarah knocked on the door. She looked hesitant, her brow furrowed in a way that usually meant something inconvenient was happening. "Talia, I'm sorry to interrupt your morning flow," she said, stepping into the office, "but there's a man in reception. He doesn't have an appointment, and he's being quite insistent. He says it's a personal emergency." My heart did a strange, heavy skip. "Did he give a name, Sarah?" "Ethan," she said. "He wouldn't give a last name, but he said you'd know who he was. He looks a bit frantic." The air in my office suddenly felt very thin. Why was he here? Had something happened to Chloe? Had my parents sent him to deliver some final crushing blow? A part of me wanted to tell her to throw him out, to let him stand in the cold the way he had left me to stand in mine. But curiosity is a powerful drug, and I needed to see the look on his face when he realized he couldn't uninvite me from my own life. "Send him in," I said, leaning back in my leather chair. "Actually, no. I'll meet him in the lobby." I wanted him to see me in my element. I wanted him to see the glass walls, the bustling staff, the sheer scale of the authority I commanded. I wanted him to see that while I might ruin the vibe at a dinner table, I ran the world he was trying to climb into. I smoothed my blazer, adjusted my watch, and walked toward the reception area. When I turned the corner, I saw him. He was pacing near the glass doors, his expensive wool coat hanging open, his hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it all morning. He looked nothing like the smug, polished man who had sat at my family's brunch. He looked hunted. The second his eyes landed on me, his entire body jolted. It wasn't a look of greeting, it was a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He stopped mid-stride, his mouth hanging slightly open, his face turning a shade of gray that matched the overcast sky outside. He didn't speak, he just stared. "Ethan," I said, my voice ringing out clearly across the lobby. "You're a long way from the family table. What can I do for you?" He didn't move. He looked around the lobby, his eyes darting from the high ceilings to the security desks, and finally, to the large brass logo of my firm mounted on the wall behind me. I watched the realization hit him like a physical wave. I watched his knees literally buckle, forcing him to grab the arm of a nearby chair to stay upright. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "No, this isn't possible." He started shaking his head, a frantic, rhythmic movement of denial. People were starting to stare. My staff, the couriers, the clients waiting for meetings. Everyone was watching the new husband crumble in front of the compliance director. "You," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You work here?" "I don't just work here, Ethan," I said, stepping closer, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "I run this department. Now, why are you making a scene in my lobby?" Loneliness makes dangerous choices feel reasonable, but standing there, I realized that my loneliness had been a gift. It had kept me focused while he was getting sloppy. He looked like he was about to vomit. He leaned in, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and whispered the words that changed everything. "Your sister, Chloe. She didn't tell me. She just said you worked in office stuff. She didn't tell me you were the Talia Morgan." I raised an eyebrow. "And why should that matter to you, Ethan? Unless, of course, you have a reason to be concerned about who I am." He looked around again, his paranoia reaching a fever pitch. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my blazer, and I immediately stepped back, my eyes flashing with a warning he finally seemed to register. "Please," he hissed. "We need to talk. Privately. Now." I led him into a small, glass-walled conference room near the entrance. I didn't offer him water. I didn't offer him a seat. I stood by the window, looking out at the city, waiting for him to break. I saw your name on the wedding list, he began, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. I thought it was a coincidence. Morgan is a common name. But then at brunch, you started talking about regulatory shifts and internal audits, and I felt sick. I asked Chloe what you did, and she just said you were a boring accountant type. She had no idea. My sister has never been particularly interested in my career, I said coldly. But you were, weren't you? I had to get you away from the family, he confessed, his face buried in his hands. If you stayed around, if we kept having those dinners, you'd eventually ask where I worked. You'd eventually see my firm's name on a business card or a letter. And I knew. I knew your firm was the one heading the investigation into our mid-level assets. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of his fear. So, that was it. The vibe he was so worried about me ruining wasn't the holiday spirit. It was his cover. He had manipulated my mother, my father, and my sister into exiling me because he was terrified that the boring accountant sister would recognize his name on a subpoena. He had destroyed my relationship with my family to protect a series of fraudulent financial reports. You uninvited me from Thanksgiving because you're a criminal, I asked, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. I'm not a criminal, he snapped, though his voice lacked any real conviction. It's just some reporting discrepancies, things that would be cleared up in a few months. But if you saw my name, you'd flag it. You'd escalate the audit. I just needed a few months of distance until the merger went through. I thought if I could keep you out of the inner circle for just one holiday season, I'd be safe. I looked at him, really looked at him. This was the man my mother had defended. This was the priority. He looked small. He looked pathetic. He had used my family's existing dysfunction, my history of being the odd one out, as a weapon to shield himself. You think very highly of yourself, Ethan, I said softly. What? You think you're the only one who does their homework? He froze. What are you talking about? I walked over to the conference table and picked up a file I'd brought with me. I opened it and slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood toward him. It was a digital footprint analysis, cross-referenced with a payroll audit from a mid-size financial consulting firm. The investigation didn't need me to recognize you at a dinner table, Ethan, I said, watching his eyes scan the page. We connected the dots last Tuesday. Your firm's fraudulent reporting wasn't just a discrepancy, it was a systemic attempt to hide a $3 million deficit before the acquisition. His face went from gray to a ghostly, translucent white. You already knew. I knew the firm was dirty, I corrected. I didn't know the face of the man signing the documents until you walked into this lobby today and confirmed your own identity. You were a John Doe on my spreadsheet until 5 minutes ago. You came here to see if I was a threat, and in doing so, you handed me the final piece of the puzzle. Desire whispers louder than guilt, and his desire to stay hidden had just shouted his confession directly into the ears of the one person who could destroy him. Talia, listen, he said, stepping toward me, his hands shaking. We're family now. Chloe, she loves me. If I go down, she goes down with me. Her lifestyle, the house we just put a deposit on, it all disappears. Think about your sister. Think about your mom. Do you really want to be the one who ruins their lives right before the holidays? I felt a sharp, bitter laugh bubble up in my chest. You're asking me to protect the vibe again, Ethan? I asked. You're asking me to stay silent for the sake of a family that didn't even want me at their table? You're asking for loyalty from a woman you just spent 48 hours systematically erasing from her own home? It wasn't personal, he cried. It was entirely personal, I countered. You used my mother's insecurities and my sister's vanity to turn them against me. You made me feel like I was a problem to be solved when the whole time you were the rot in the room. He fell silent. The frantic energy seemed to leak out of him, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man. He realized finally that there was no vibe left to save. There was only the cold, hard reality of the law. I checked my watch. In about 10 minutes, my team is going to file the official report with the federal authorities, I said. Your name will be at the top of the list of individuals recommended for questioning. If I were you, I'd spend this Thanksgiving finding a very good lawyer. Though, I suppose you'll have plenty of time to talk to one since you won't have to worry about ruining the vibe at dinner anymore. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and awe. You're a monster, he whispered. No, I said, opening the door for him. I'm just the one who follows the rules. And the rule is, you don't get to kick me out of my family and then ask me for a favor. He walked out of the conference room, his head hanging low, his footsteps heavy and defeated. I watched him cross the lobby and disappear through the revolving glass doors back into the city that was no longer his playground. The moment he was gone, the tension in my shoulders finally broke. My assistant Sarah was standing by her desk, her eyes wide as she watched the exchange. "Talia?" she asked softly. "Is everything okay?" I took a deep breath, the air in the office feeling cleaner than it had in days. "Everything is exactly as it should be, Sarah," I said. "By the way, I'm taking Thanksgiving off after all, but I won't be heading home." I went back to my desk and pulled up a travel website. I booked a flight to a small quiet town in Vermont, a place with no family, no vibes to maintain, and no one to tell me where I did or didn't belong. Later that evening, my phone started blowing up. First, it was a text from Chloe. "Talia, what did you do? Ethan is home and he's hysterical. He says you're trying to ruin him. Answer me." Then, a call from my mother, which I let go to voicemail. Her voice sounded panicked, a far cry from the cold, clinical woman who had uninvited me. "Talia, pick up. There's been some mistake. Ethan says you're being difficult. We need to talk about this as a family." I listened to the message twice. I thought about the rosemary stuffing and the wine. I thought about the grocery list in the trash. They didn't want to talk to me because they loved me. They wanted to talk to me because the vibe was finally, irrevocably broken, and they needed me to fix it. They needed the boring accountant daughter to perform a miracle and make the crimes of their golden boy disappear. I didn't call back. Instead, I packed a small bag, grabbed a coat, and headed to the airport. As I sat in the terminal, watching the planes take off into the dark velvet of the night, I felt a strange sense of peace. Sometimes, being uninvited is the greatest gift you can receive. It shows you exactly who people are when they think you have nothing to offer them. It strips away the masks and leaves only the truth. And the truth, as it turns out, is the only thing worth bringing to the table. If you've ever been the one left out in the cold while the rest of the world stayed warm inside, just remember, the walls that keep you out also keep the fire from burning you when the whole house finally goes up in flames. If you want to see how this story ends for Ethan, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss the update on the fallout. My family wanted a Thanksgiving without drama. They wanted a holiday where everything felt perfect and everyone felt comfortable. I hope they enjoy the silence. I know I will. The truth doesn't need an invitation to the table. It has a way of showing up exactly when the party is at its peak. And as for the vibe, I think I finally found mine. Would you like me to create a follow-up story exploring the fallout of the investigation and the family's reaction?